and it's a privilege to be here. It's an unsought privilege, and as Chris says, I am no expert. You are the experts. I feel I'm talking to people who know far more about what I intend to say than I do, really. Just one thing before I start. Yesterday I was in a British museum, and there's a wonderful exhibition which I think is well worth seeing, and it's a temporary one. Just on your right as you come in, there's one called Journeys. It's one small room. It is partly the creation of an Iraqi poet who also draws, and it is the journey by sea of somebody to whom he is writing. Wonderfully moving thing, and a fascinating couple of other things besides. Now, I'm a poet, and I will intersperse 3 short poems into this, so be prepared. I'm, as I said, grateful to be invited to the talk. I'm going to talk basically about being here rather than being in Hungary. Hungary is altogether another subject on which I can and often do talk for hours without being stopped because I get very involved in what is happening there. So I speak in my character as actually an unwitting child refugee. I mean, I didn't know, I was no part of the decision. I was just 8 in 1956. 1956 was a Hungarian uprising. Some of you will have read about that. Went on for 13 days, and sometime towards the end of it, a lot of people left Hungary. So I speak in my persona as that, partly as a poet, and as a translator a little bit. An occasional writer of articles in the press about various things, sometimes reviews, but occasionally even about something like this. The issue of Brexit, about the campaign itself, the impact of the campaign, and its likely future impact, which is, I'm trying to think around a little bit. And of course I can only speculate. We are not out yet. We don't know anything about the terms of this engagement, and we have no clear idea of how this or that set of terms may impact on our particular lives, whoever we are. I did in fact campaign for Remain in my small town, Windham, in Norfolk, which voted out, although Norwich encouragingly voted to remain. It is a very minor experience, and I cannot base too much upon that. But I can tell you that the most frequent answers I got from leavers on the doorstep, and others may or may not corroborate this, there were 2. One was, they will not tell us what to do anymore, whatever that was. And the other was, things used to be better before. So those were the 2 things. That'll be familiar to most of you here. And they seem to actually, in a way, to be perfectly rational responses to 2 major arguments of the Leave campaign regarding sovereignty and free movement of people. The way those arguments were presented elicited precisely those responses. As I've already said, I'm not qualified to address these questions because I'm not an expert in any of the relevant areas. I'm not in fact likely to be very directly affected. I've been here for an awful long time. But I am by birth, if you like, parti pris. I am actually a foreigner, and I'm occasionally reminded that I am so. And therefore, being a foreigner, I'm one of those factors in things having been better before my arrival, or people like me. I don't want to caricature the Leave campaign. I don't want to call those who voted differently from me stupid, simple, racist. I don't want to use language like that. Life is far more complicated. Now, I did have some intelligent conversations with those who did want to leave, particularly those on a kind of Chomskyite left of the political spectrum, whose arguments center on globalization, capitalism, high finance, as expressed occasionally in terms of sovereignty. So there was what seemed to be an immediately intelligent argument there. And I said I don't want to caricature the Leave campaign, but the day after the referendum. There was an incident in Norwich, a city, as I said, that had voted to remain, in a region that voted out, in which a small Romanian supermarket was firebombed. Not very effectively, but it was. Students at the university, from which I've now retired, immediately set up an appeal to raise £500. By the next morning, they had raised over 20,000. So the field was not altogether lost, not in Norwich anyway, despite what we are continually told about the clear will of the people. There were enough people willing to raise money for a minor, if demonized, enterprise. I don't think demonization is too harsh a word, in that I think Leave rhetoric deliberately called up certain demons. It consciously opened the trapdoors where I think certain demons were hiding. It legitimized them, it legitimized the demons. It called forth the firebombers in its own distant sort of way. It called forth those who immediately set upon people I knew, elderly widows of French and German birth, who had lived in the country for decades, who were immediately asked, well, when are you going home? It called forth, I think, those teenagers on a Manchester tram who demanded that black Americans should get off it. And in its own way, I think it did call forth the murder of Joe Cox. I think there were other processes in that, but I personally think it's a factor. By the time we'd got to there, I think a certain madness had set in. All the Leagues, of course, rushed to distance themselves from the murder particularly, but from almost everything else. This has nothing to do with them. None of these other xenophobic incidents, and there have been, and continue to be plenty of others, had anything to do with them. There's nothing to do with their presentation of sinister foreigners in Brussels, of sinister gangs of Albanians hanging around Dover and Boston, or with the sinister cheap labour of mushroom pickers and chicken packers, in Attleborough particularly, who were taking those much coveted jobs from true Brits. That was not what they meant. They had nothing to do with encouraging the taxi driver, for example, we met the other day, who had moved from King's Lynn because there were, he said, far too many Lithuanians and Poles there. There are a lot of Lithuanians, mostly seasonal workers, but not all. These foreigners, whose rather marvellous supermarkets down a side street were, as he said, as he put it, taking the place over. So, perhaps what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back in time and I'll take a more personal line, because I think in a way that's what I've been partly invited to do. To think about what might make one properly British or possibly a foreigner. My family of four, father, mother, myself, my younger brother, along with some 200,000 others, that is 1/50th of the whole population of the country, left Hungary in the months following the defeat of that 1956 revolution. I'm not personally entirely sure why we left. My parents had taken no part in the fighting and were unlikely to be arrested in the repercussions. My father, as a leader of a department within the Ministry of Building, who had got there by extraordinary means had been through forced labour, working with a plumber, but having essentially the right working class credentials, leading a department, one of 12 departments in the Ministry of Building, he would have been exposed in the revolution itself, of course, as being part of the apparatus. And indeed as a Jew, because that was an aspect, I think, of the revolution. I think a minor aspect, but it was certainly pleasant. But I think he would have stayed. It was my mother who insisted that we should leave. Why? Why did she do so? I don't think it was for ideological reasons. Both my parents were of the left, and I believe that my mother was further to the left than my father, although she wasn't admitted to the party because she came from a middle class background. He came from the right background. So it wasn't for ideology. Didn't want to live in a capitalist country. It wasn't that. they could have survived perfectly well, I think, in a kind of post-Stalin state. Ideology would have kept them at home, probably. They lived reasonably well in a given context. We weren't economic migrants. We didn't come here in order to make more money. We weren't starving. We weren't in problems. The truth is, I think, is that my mother was afraid, not so much for herself as for us, her children. She had survived 2 concentration camps. My father, as I said, survived forced labor. And basically they had history gnawing at their nerves. And I think a lot of Hungarians do, but they specifically had. Neither of them could have demonstrated that their lives were in immediate danger. But instead, they took the dangerous impromptu risk of simply walking out of the country at night in a wholly arbitrary party of about a dozen or so people who all happened to get off at a same small railway station. Going walking across the Austrian border and arriving there with 1 suitcase full of clothes and 1 tiny little case full of photographs, which I was delegated to carry across the, God knows how many miles it was. It might not have been that many. I was just small and I didn't know. At that stage, I had 3 words of English. Those 3 words were and, but, so. And those words come from A.A. Milne's Now We Are Six, of which we had a bilingual edition, as we did of Winnie the Pooh, in a rather marvellous Hungarian translation by a wonderful comic writer of the pre-war period. This is a point at which I'll read you a poem. This is actually about crossing a border, which is something I do remember in a sort of odd fragmentary way, which isn't so much, not even a YouTube clip, it's a series of GIFs, as you walk across something. My father carries me across the field. It has a number of references to Winnie the Pooh, so any A.A. Milne fans will recognize these things. My father carries me across a field. It's night, and there are trenches filled with snow, thick mud. We're careful to remain concealed from something frightening I don't yet know. And then I walk, and there is space between the 4 of us. We go where we have to go. Did I dream it all, this ghostly scene? The 100-acre wood where the owl blinked and the ass spoke, where I am cozy and clean in bed, but we are floating, our arms linked over the landscape. My father moves ahead of me like some strange, almost extinct species, and I follow him in dread across the field towards my own extinction. Spirits everywhere are drifting over blasted terrain. The winter cold makes no distinction between them and us. My father looks round and smiles and turns away. We have no function in this place, but keep moving without sound. Lost figures who leave only a blank page behind them and the dark and frozen ground they pass across as they might cross a stage. Well, we might well have been moving into a form of extinction. I think people do. My parents would never again be what they had been, or become what they might have become, nor I, of course. Once in Austria, the process of unbecoming became relatively easy. We were talking about this last night. Refugee services were waiting for us, both in Austria and a few days later in the UK. After we had been offered a flight there. We had no money, obviously, it was Hungarian money is non-convertible anyway, and we arrived with nothing, apart from 1 suitcase, clothes, and the photographs. So we were offered a free flight. The reception once we arrived was highly efficient and extremely kindly. We were, I believe, regarded as victim heroes of a failed but heroic uprising against the Cold War enemy. Sentiment was with us. So people were very prepared to accept us and even take us into their houses. Sentiment was with us, but so was our historical baggage. In Metro, which is the longest poem of my career, some 780 lines, there are a couple of verses in which I try to sum up what we had left behind in Budapest. The physical city in the poem stands in for its own history. And I just want to give you a tiny little taste of that, of just a few lines. I returned to Budapest for the first time probably in 1984 and suddenly felt the whole place like a great hallucinatory opening up to a territory which I hadn't met in many, many years. It was a kind of empire in a way, and of course it was a remnant of a very specific empire. It was the Hungarian Empire. These are the few lines. The empire underground. The tunneling begins. The earth gives up her worms and shards, old coins, components, ordnance, bone and glass, nails, muscle, hair, flesh, shriveled bits of string, shoe leather, buttons, jewels, instruments. And out of these come voices, words, stenches and scents, and finally desire pulled like a tooth. It's that or constancy that leads us down to find a history that feels like truth. Now, that baggage is the kind of thing any refugee from anywhere brings with them. It is a real baggage of those who leave under certain traumatic circumstances, without much deliberation or calculation, without time to deliberate, which is what it was like that. We just went. The children and teenagers I think of in the jungle of Calais carry something similar, because they have their histories too, however short they are. They bring their foreignness with them to squat in the mud of an alien port, and bringing that foreignness with oneself is what this part is about. Now, England wasn't our destination. That was Australia, where my father had a cousin who had emigrated in 1948. We had no one in England, nobody. Australia rejected us because of my mother's health, so we had to remain, along with some 28,000 other Hungarians who remained in the UK at the time. So what did we offer our kindly hosts? And kindly they were. My father had some English before we came. He actually served as an interpreter for others. The rest of us, my mother, brother and I, had none except my 3 words. The English my father possessed, as I said, made him useful in helping to process other refugees, which is what he did, while we spent 4 months, along with those others, in various off-season boarding houses in or near Margate, attending English classes. My father interpreted for fellow refugees who were sent off to jobs depending on what their skills were, in Wolverhampton, in Luton, Newcastle, whatever. My father's particular skill lay in plumbing, heating and ventilation at a kind of managerial level. So he found him, first a job in London, afterwards he found his own. And remarkably enough, when you think about it now, they actually enabled us to put down a deposit in our first house in London. Whoever it was in the Home Office simply rang up the local bank and said, give this guy a mortgage. We trust him. And they did that. A remarkable act of generosity when I think about it now. As just a child, I knew nothing of this at the time. It made lifelong Anglophiles of us all, so that 4 of us would think, hey, this is a very good place. Meanwhile, my mother, a press photographer as she had been, worked in a photographic studio in Oxford Street. Having settled in, we set about assimilating. I use that word quite deliberately. First of all, we were to speak English, not Hungarian at home. Now imagine my father speaks broken English, my mother doesn't, but between the pair of them they speak English to us, and we have to speak English to them. They speak Hungarian between each other, but it worked. We learned English fairly quickly. Why? We would never go back. Very few people in the world speak Hungarian, so the language would be redundant and only slow down the rate at which the children, learned English and made a go of school. Budapest was no longer home. My father anglicized the pronunciation of his name to Szirtes, which is generally known in this country anyway, through my father. Same as a racing driver who recently died. Even altering his spelling for work purposes only, so that when he went out to visit building sites, people would not be struggling about how do you say that. So he spelt it Surtwes, which is not how we officially spelled it. His face and accent, of course, did not accord with the adopted name, which suggests that you come from the northeast of England somewhere. His accent was pretty thick. He's dead now. My mother died back in 75, my father in 2010. But it was, I think, a relaxed and reasonable ambience. By the time we began our English school careers, of course, there were other immigrant issues to think about. We were one batch in a particular set of circumstances. There were the Notting Hill riots, 1958, I think, for example. 10 years later, you will know about Enoch Powell's famous Rivers of Blood speech. Then just 4 years after that came the Uganda Nations, in the wake of Idi Amin and so forth. We might have been foreign, but at least we were white. And because we were white and less conspicuous, we did not experience some of the resentment, I think, that met West Indians or Asians. We were privileged, I think, in that respect. We took the mild, if diffident, benevolence of England for granted. We had melted in, hadn't we? And the country into which we had melted was a stable, powerful force in the world, a safe place. Ever less powerful now, perhaps, ever less imperial, but safe. It's an island, it's surrounded by sea. Hungary is like an amoeba, it constantly changes shape. And in 1984, as I say, I returned to Hungary for the first time as an adult, and kept returning. In 1989, my family and I spent almost a whole year there, watching the state fall apart. 10 years later, after several books, I changed publishers for the second time, and my work to that date was sorted into two distinct volumes. One, the Budapest File, 2000, when it came out, dealing with work that had a Hungarian interest, by which time I'd written quite a lot that had. And one titled An English Apocalypse, the next year. That dealt with settling in England and simply being here. That left out an awful lot of other poems which are not about those things, but there it is. In this way, my work and self and other people's consciousness of myself was neatly divided into two. One acquired a dual nationality, a dual cultural. I used to be introduced, by the way, to all the audience were reading poems, originally just as a poet, and I was introduced as a Hungarian poet, despite never having written a word in Hungarian. And then later when I wrote Metro, which is essentially about the removal of my mother from Budapest deportation, then I became to introduced as a Jewish Hungarian poet, despite the fact that I was not brought up with any religion whatsoever. They were atheists, those my parents. Now, An English Apocalypse was chiefly written in Ireland, when I was a fellow at Trinity College Dublin there, and contained a lot of memories of the 70s, but also registered what I sensed then was a mounting crisis in British identity, English identity. The two things are not the same. Certainly in English identity, particularly, because I think the Scottish sense of identity was rising. The Irish identity was always very strong. And in fact, possibly what prompted the poem is actually being in Ireland, where, of course, at some stage, a certain kind of almost crass hostility towards England was fairly normal. So it was based about this crisis of the English identity. There were, at the end of this set of 25 poems, there were 5 apocalypses. I'll read you one of the apocalypses. It's called Death by Deluge. I have seen, and as you know, in Norfolk, there's a huge amount of erosion, and bits of cliff are falling away, and we're gradually becoming smaller and smaller. Death by Deluge. I have seen roads come to a full stop in mid-sentence, as if their meaning had fallen off the world. And this is what happened. What meaning did that day in August? The North Sea had been rough and rising, and the bells of Dunwich rang through all of Suffolk. One wipe of its cuff down cliffs, and in they went, leaving birds to hang puzzled in the air, their nests gone. Enormous tides ran from Southend to Cromer. They swung north and south at once, as if with a clear purpose, thrusting through Lincolnshire and at a rush drowning Sleaford, Newark, leaving no house uncovered. Nothing remained of the wash but water. Peterborough, Ely, March and Cambridge were followed by Royston, Stevenage, the lush grass of Shaw's Corner. Not a single ridge remained. The Thames Valley filled to the brim, and London clays swallowed Wapping and Greenwich. Then west, roaring and boiling, a rapid skim of Hampshire and Dorset, then the peninsula, Paynton, Plymouth, Lyme, Land's End. A slim line of high hills held out, but all was watercolour, the pure English medium, intended for sky, cloud and sea, less earth than you could shift with a spatula. So it's a sense that the thing is being washed away, which I felt quite keenly because, as I said earlier, I was brought up with Anglophiles. I didn't like to see the place in this great condition of uncertainty. It seemed to me from the poem, it's funny, sometimes one reasons back from when you've written it, and then you think, well, why did I do that? And why was it so much the 70s? Well, it seems to me that something important began in the 70s, about the time of EU entry, in fact. There's a decade of the 3-day week, the winter of discontent, the rise of Margaret Thatcher, to be followed by the destruction of the old stable industries, the old communities associated with them. And somebody had to be blamed for this. And who would it be? Well, the EU was the easiest scapegoat, egged on by parts of the popular press, as you know. And if Britain was falling apart by 2001, which is when I published An English Apocalypse, that can't have been Britain's fault, can it? Who took away our pounds and ounces, our 12 pence to the shilling, and our pride? It was the perceived demons of faceless foreign bureaucrats who met our own long, resentful demons, the ones behind the trapdoors. These powerful foreign demons allowed still more foreigners in, though many of those foreigners had nothing to do with the EU and more to do with globalization, the disasters of war and the prevalence of what was interpreted as political correctness in the internet age. What I'm suggesting is that that which was successfully suppressed after Notting Hill was struggling for maneuver in 2016 and found an outlet here. So it's a longer process. I'll finish with a tiny incident. 2 or 3 years ago, I was chairing a small literary festival in a small Norfolk town where I live. In order to publicize the event, we decided to read poems in a marketplace on market day. Fun, it's good. Somebody there decided to read John Batcherman's poem A Subaltern's Love Song. Do you know this? Miss Joan Hunter Dunn, Miss Joan Hunter Dunn, furnished and burnished by Aldershot's son. What strenuous singles we played after tea. We in the tournament, you against me. Lovely thing, I've known it for absolutely ages. It kind of conjures England, particularly, I suppose, in the 1930s that we talked about. And after the event, the sweetest and nicest person on the committee came to me and said, I don't suppose you will ever fully understand that poem, George. And maybe he's right. Maybe I don't fully understand them. Maybe even to the very nicest of men, a foreigner can never truly be of the atavistic tribe. That stuff that understands at a very deep vein level what it is to belong to your tribe. It wouldn't be peculiar to the English, of course, to the English tribe. It's true of tribes generally, I think. So it's not a gripe about being English. And I think things like this when people begin to feel tribal under pressure, and that's the kind of pressure I think I was referring to from the 70s. This is pure hypothesis. I have no way of proving this whatsoever. Just a feeling. Well, maybe the tribe wants us out now. Or a good number of us. Maybe the door to Brexit is the door out for some of us. Not me, as I say. I've been here 60 years. I'm a British citizen, and I have been since 1964 or 65. I can never quite remember. I was just sort of a child. I will finish now with a short poem titled Port Selda. There is a much loved popular poem by the Anglo-Welsh poet Edward Thomas titled Addlestrop. Do people notice? It's been on the poems on the Underground. It's only a short poem. What happens there? He's on his train. It's 1917. And the train stops, unwanted, as he says, at this platform, and the only thing he sees is the word Addlestrop, which is the title of the poem. And it's utter silence, and it's sunshine, and what he hears there, he says towards the end, he hears all the birds of Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire. And this poem has been taken to heart. Anybody who kind of knows a bit of poetry, a book's written about it. There are anthologies called Addlestrop, which conjure forth that same sense of being, although Edward Thomas is Anglo-Welsh, of being specifically English. And Thomas, of course, went on to be killed that year on the front. So there is this great association, not just with him happening to be there, but also being one of the last things that he sees. Port Selda is in fact precisely Addlestrop spelled backwards. So this is about arriving in Port Selda. It is about the beauty of the country. It's very short, and it's about a sort of inevitability, about rejection, a rejection which isn't malicious. It is in a way within the bone, but we live with it one way or the other. Yes, and I don't live it with any resentment. When this very nice man said, "We'll never understand that," I thought I did understand it. I thought I knew that. I thought that was why I liked it. But then he says, "No, you don't," and it doesn't mean any harm by it. But it's the well. Out of that well comes, I think, all these other things. So many of us, I think, are at Port Selda now. So I'll read you this 12 lines. The immigrant at Port Selda. I got off at Port Selda and looked out for the harbour, but it was quiet. Nothing smelled of the sea. All I saw was a station by a well-kept arbour with a notice pinned to a tree. It said, "Welcome to Port Selda, you who will never be our collective unconscious, nor of our race. This is the one true genealogical tree, and this the notice you will not deface." It was beautiful there. It was Friday in late autumn, and all the birds of the county sang their hearts out. I noted down the date. The sun was shining, and the church bells rang. That's it. Thank you. Stay here.
So we've got some time for some questions for George. History knowing at their nerves really gave me goose pimples when you uttered those words. The relationship between extinction, the sense of extinction and disruption, travellers squatting in foreign mud, and also the processes of assimilation and becoming English, not to mention the tribalism coming out of the well. George, you're a poet, but you're also a sociologist. I feel like we should just take you back to my department and give you an office. Any questions for George?
Do you feel, you've been here for such a long time, but do you feel that your sense of being Hungarian has grown with being here for a long time as you get older? Do you feel that your attachment, if there is any, to Hungary perhaps grows slightly stronger than with time?
No. I don't. I feel it has grown oddly weaker, partly because of events in Hungary itself. I thought when I first went back, and I had this hallucinatory 3 weeks, which I wandered around the city and I thought, it's not that I recognize this place or that place. I just knew the space, I knew the sound, I knew the smell, I knew the colours. And I thought, something extraordinary is happening. I felt very, very happy. At the end of that time, I hadn't been translating before. And there was a party they gave, because I went as a writer and I went through official channels. And at the end of it, somebody asked me to, would you translate this? I said, yeah, of course. My Hungarian was actually quite poor. If they'd asked me to do the washing up for the next 3 years, I would have said yes, I was so pleased. So I was terribly moved by all that. I'm still moved by a great deal of it. There's a wonderful book which I'm sure some of you know, Eva Hoffman's Lost in Translation. Do people know this? She describes what happens to her parents. It was better for me. For my parents, it is a kind of extinction. It was a kind of extinction. For Eva's father and mother. Father was a big social wheeler dealer in Krakow. Then he goes out to Vancouver, where he's nobody. His wheeler dealer ways are of no use whatsoever. He can't get used to the manners. He is extinguished. You feel this very, very strongly in the book. So I think there is I find it hard to be terribly optimistic about it. I don't feel I feel gloomy. I'm not gloomy. I just think, well, it's the way things are. But of course, there are times when it's better, and there are times when it's worse. And I think it's worse now.
Yes.
John Betjeman, you brought up, so that's the response to you, and the personal response in Norfolk. The business about negotiating who you are, really. Because I mean, I don't know whether that's an experience for you. I just sort of think back, this guy called Stuart Hall, wasn't there?
Stuart Hall,
yes.
Yeah. Talked about his dad coming over and told when he filled in forms, you know, what right? Well, you Caribbean? No, I'm not. I'm wherever he was from, I don't know, Jamaica. No, you're Caribbean. You're told who you are. Now that experience of being told who you are, you then have to negotiate that. Is that something? I mean, that just felt like that when you were talking about the response to Betjeman, really.
That process goes on in everybody, whoever they are, I think.
Yeah.
But there are specific ways in which it goes on other people who have to speak for themselves as to how they find it and that they found it. I've always thought British was a very useful way of describing myself. I thought it was a good administrative term. That is what I was. I could be that. Being English is a different matter. Negotiating that, well, you don't think about it all the time. I mean, you're faced with specific things. I'm faced with specific things if I meet with Hungarians, official Hungarians in the current sense, and informal ones on the other. I don't think it's I would sort of console myself if I need consoling. I don't know if it's consolation I need. Is that an awful lot of people now are not where they were born. One of the common things that one's asked as a poet sometimes is, who do you write for? And I devised two answers for this, which I'm still quite happy to give. Number one, for all the dead people in there who I've read, who I've admired. They're alive as well, not in a whole way. And number two, for people on trains. People going from here to there, who are not, they're neither a destination. I think that's a fairly common existential condition. So, in a paradoxical way, I don't feel isolated by this. I think I'm relatively representative within a specific context.
Any more questions? Comments? Well, if there's no more, well, we're going to have a short break now, so if you're too shy to ask a question in front of everyone, George will be
I'm around all day.
Will be around all day. So please speak to him throughout the event. So we start back again at 10:30, so we've got a nice break for some more muffins, coffee, tea, whatever we like. Thank you very much.